Temporomandibular joint, muscles, teeth, and their functions. Joint or articulation refers to a connection between two separate parts of the skeleton. The temporomandibular joint or the TMJ is an articulation between the temporal bone and the mandible. But exactly what parts of this bone forms the TMJ, we'll discuss those in the next slides. The TMJ is unique in such a way that this is the only visible, free-moving joint in the head. All other bones of the skull are connected by sutures and are immovable. It is also a bilateral articulation, having a right and a left TMJ working as a unit. So these are the structures that forms the temporomandibular joint. In the mandible, only the mandibular condyle forms part of the TMJ. The mandibular condyle is rounded from front to back and from side to side. It is shaped into a knob-like form in order to fit into the concave fossa on the base of the skull called the articular or the glenoid fossa. It can also be referred to as the mandibular fossa. Here in this image, this is the inferior view of the skull. So the other half of the mandible is removed, showing the mandibular fossa in the temporal bone. This is another image showing the mandibular fossa. The other half of the mandible here is retained to show the relationship of the mandibular condyle to the mandibular fossa. The glenoid fossa, the mandibular fossa, or the articular fossa is an oval or oblong depression in the temporal bone found immediately anterior to the auditory canal. This is the auditory canal. So it's found anterior, the mandibular fossa is found anterior to the auditory canal. The articular fossa is considered as a non-functioning portion of the joint because when the teeth are in tight occlusion, or the maxillary and mandibular teeth contacts and occludes together, there is actually no forceful contact between the head of the condyle and the articular fossa. The functional portion of the glenoid fossa is the articular eminence, here, particularly the posterior surface of the articular eminence. The articular eminence is a transverse bony ridge forming the anterior border or the boundary of the mandibular fossa. This surface of the eminence and the functioning portion of the condyle, which is the superior and anterior surfaces of the condyle, is padded with a thick layer of tough, fibrous tissue called the articular disc. Okay. Here in this image where the mandible is removed, you can see the lateral aspect of the mandibular fossa. Here you can see the relationship of the condyle to the mandibular fossa. You can see here that they are not directly connected with each other, but instead they have an articular disc in between. The articular disc acts as a cushion between the bones at the point of contact like a shock absorber. This white tissue here is the articular disc. It also stabilizes the condyle. The condyle does not contact the glenoid fossa, right? So it's actually not stable because it does not have anything that holds it to the fossa. The space between the two is filled by the articular disc, thereby stabilizing the condyle. It is especially thick on the functioning portions. The articular disc divides the space into an upper and lower joint spaces or synovial cavities. Okay, here in this picture, This is the upper synovial cavity or the superior cavity. Here is the lower space. This is the articular disc. These joint spaces or synovial cavities allows for the complex functional movements of the mandible. We'll discuss this in detail as we go on. The articular disc is also void of blood vessels and nerves. What it contains are proprioceptive fibers that help regulate the movements of the condyle by unconsciously determining the positions of the mandible. The articular disc, being void of blood vessel and nerves, gets its supply of nutrients from a fibrous capsule, which encapsulates the TMJ. This capsule is called the joint capsule. Here is the TMJ capsule or the joint capsule. Here in this image, it refers to this area here shaded green. Again, the joint capsule encloses the joint and by doing so limits its movement. The internal surface of the capsule is lined with the synovial membrane, which secretes the synovial fluid that lubricates and nourishes the fibrous covering of the articulating surfaces and center of the disc that lack a blood supply. The outer layer of the capsule is the one that contains veins, nerves, and collagen fibers. The joint capsule is also considered as one of the mandibular ligaments that are accessory to the TMJ. It is also called or referred to as the capsular ligament. The capsular ligament or the joint capsule originates around articular fossa and eminence of the temporal bone, inserts at the neck of the condyle, and its action includes limiting the excessive forward movement of the articular disc. It also prevents excessive movement of the condyle on wide openings. The anterolateral side of the capsule may be thickened to form a band referred to as the temporomandibular ligament or the lateral ligament. So this is the temporomandibular ligament, this is the lateral ligament. They refer to the same structure. They originate from the zygomatic arch. So this is the zygomatic arch. And inserts at the lateral and posterior neck of the condyle. It keeps the condyle close to the fossa and helps prevent lateral and posterior displacement of the mandible. The other two mandibular ligaments are the spinomandibular ligament, yellow. This is also the spinomandibular ligament. And the stylomandibular ligament. Stylomandibular ligament. Spinomandibular ligament originates from the angular spine of the sphenoid bone and petrotympanic fissure. It inserts the lingula of the mandible. It helps limit maximum opening of the jaw. The stylomandibular ligament, on the other hand, originates from the styloid process of the temporal bone and inserts at the posterior border or end angle of the mandible. It limits excessive protrusion of the mandible. The foremandibular ligaments are slightly elastic bands of tissue that stabilize the articular system during jaw movements. They do not actually move the joint. What they do is support and confine the movement of the mandible to protect the muscles from being stretched beyond their capabilities. Movement of the joint is a function of the muscles of mastication. So this is a table summarizing the four mandibular ligaments that are accessory to the TMJ. If you see, if you notice the action of these ligaments, most of them limits excessive movement of the mandible. Although the mandibular ligaments do not have a direct relationship with mandibular articulation, they are also considered part of the masticatory system. The TMJ is also unique in such a way that the movement of the TMJ is a combination of hinge and gliding movements. That's why TMJ is also referred to as a ginglimo-arthrosal joint. Ginglimus rather, refers to a joint that allows the mandible to rotate like a hinge against the base of the skull. When we say hinge, the movement or the action is rotation around an axis. Arthroja, on the other hand, is the capability of the mandible to bodily move or glide forward or from side to side. Hinge or rotational movement occurs within the lower joint space here. Okay? Hinge movement is possible only when opening the mandible up to about halfway and the mandible is not being pulled forward. In the upper joint space, the movement is translational. This is the upper joint space. When we say translation, it is the bodily movement of the mandible downward and forward onto the articular eminence. So this is the articular eminence. The articular eminence and the concavity of the glenoid fossa actually dictates the path of the translation of the condyle. Translation occurs when one open and close the mouth beyond about halfway. Most movements of the jaw is a combination of rotation and translation, including during eating, swallowing, yawning, and talking. Again, the movement of the jaw is a function of the muscles of the mastication. We have four main muscles that are involved in mastication. We can use the mnemonics time to refer to these four. T stands for temporalis muscle, I for the internal or medial pterygoid muscle, M masseter, and E the external or the lateral pterygoid muscle. The temporalis muscle here is a fan-shaped, large and flat muscle with both vertical anterior and middle fibers. It also has a horizontal posterior fiber. It originates from the temporal fossa. Here is the temporal fossa. From the temporal fossa, the anterior and the middle fibers of the temporalis are directed vertically downward, while its posterior fibers are directed more horizontally, passing medial to the zygomatic arch to insert the coronoid process of the mandible. Again, this is the coronoid process of the mandible. So this blue area here is where the temporalis muscle inserts to. Okay, this line here is the origin of the temporalis muscle. Because the anterior and middle fibers of the temporalis are oriented vertically, their contraction produces elevation of the mandible or closing of the jaw, especially when great power is not required. Remember that the muscles moves from the insertion towards the origin. Okay? So if this is the insertion of the temporalis muscle, when it contracts, it moves towards the origin, thereby elevating the mandible or closing the jaw. The posterior fiber, on the other hand, is oriented horizontally so that when it contracts this way, from insertion to origin, it protrudes or pulls the mandible posteriorly. Again, the posterior horizontal fibers moves this way, thereby protruding or pulling the mandible posteriorly. Next is the masseter muscle. The masseter is the most superficial, bulky, and powerful of the muscles of the mastication. It is four-sided in shape. It originates from the inferior and medial surfaces of the zygomatic arch. So this is the region of the masseter muscle. From here in the zygomatic arch, it extends interiorly and posteriorly towards the inferior lateral surface of the ramus and the angle of the mandible. The action of the masseter produces elevation of the mandible or closing of the jaw, and it applies great power in crushing of the food. Okay? So again, the movement is from insertion to origin. So when the masseter contracts, it also produces elevation of the mandible. Next is the pterygoid muscles. So we have the internal or the medial and the external or the lateral pterygoid muscles. The yellow refers to the the lateral pterygoid muscle rather. Green refers to the internal or medial pterygoid muscle. Okay. The internal pterygoid muscle is located on the medial surface of the ramus. Okay. This is posterior view. Okay. So you can see here the internal pterygoid muscle. Along with the masseter, located on the lateral surface here, these two muscles serve as a sling. So they look like a sling. The internal pterygoid muscle originates from the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate here and pterygoid fossa of the sphenoid bone. It inserts into the medial surface of the mandible in a triangular region at the angle and on adjacent portions of the ramus just above the triangle. So it has the same insertion as that of the masseter, except that the internal pterygoid muscle inserts at the medial aspect or the internal or interior aspect of the mandible. So its action also elevates the mandible. Although not as large or powerful, it works together with the larger masseter muscle in helping to apply power or great force upon closing the teeth together. The external pterygoid muscle, compared to the other three, has its fibers oriented primarily horizontally. It is a short, thick, somewhat conical muscle located deep in the infratemporal fossa and is the prime mover of the mandible except for closing the jaw. It arises from two heads that are both located on the sphenoid bone. The smaller superior head here is attached to the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid, while the larger inferior head is attached to the adjacent lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate on the sphenoid bone. It inserts on the depression on the front of the neck of the condyle called the pterygoid fovea. So here is the pterygoid fovea. It also inserts into the anterior margin of the articular disc. Okay, in this image, this is the articular disc. Okay, so some fibers of the external pterygoid muscles also inserts into the articular disc. When both lateral pterygoids contract simultaneously, so the left and right external pterygoid muscles contracts together, it protrudes the mandible. No other muscle are capable of this action, but can only assist as stabilizers or by controlling the degree of jaw opening and protrusion. Simultaneous contraction of this muscle also causes depression of the mandible. They do this by pulling the articular discs and the condyles forward and downward onto the articular eminence, which moves the mandible inferiorly and helps rotate it, thereby opening the mouth. The lateral pterygoids are assisted somewhat in this task by the suprahyoid and infrahyoid muscles. So again, when the left and right external pterygoid muscles contracts, so if this area here is the insertion of the external pterygoid muscle, the movement of the muscle or the contraction of the muscles is directed toward, it is directed anteriorly. So is this the only muscle capable of protruding the mandible? By virtue of its attachment to the articular disc, so when it contracts that way, it brings the articular disc and the condyle downward and forward, thereby opening the mouth. When only one lateral pterygoid contracts, it pulls the condyle on that side toward the midline and anteriorly, moving the body of the mandible toward the opposite side. For example, the right lateral pterygoid contracts, it draws the right condyle medially or to the left and forward, causing the mandible to move toward the left side. This is what we refer to as left lateral excursion. No other muscle is also capable of moving the mandible sideways. So only the external pterygoid muscle is capable of protruding the mandible and moving the mandible from left to right. It is also the only muscles among the four that causes depression of the mandible. Okay? So this is a table summarizing the four muscles of mastication. So again, notice here the last column. So the temporalis muscle, the internal pterygoid, and the masseter all produces elevation of the mandible. Only the external pterygoid muscle is capable of depressing and protruding the mandible by virtue of their simultaneous contraction. When unilateral contraction occurs, there is lateral excursion. These are the other muscles that affects mandibular movement. So they are grouped into two, the suprahyoid muscles and the infrahyoid muscles. The suprahyoid muscles extend superiorly from the hyoid bone to the mandible. We have four suprahyoid muscles: the stylohyoid, the digastric muscle, particularly the anterior belly, the mylohyoid muscle, which forms the floor of the mouth, and the gynohyoid muscle. The infrahyoid muscles, on the other hand, extend inferiorly from the hyoid bone. So from the hyoid bone, it extends inferiorly and that inserts into the clavicle and sternum and adjacent structures. So you also have four infrahyoid muscles: the omohyoid muscle, the sternohyoid muscle, the sternothyroid muscle here. So you can see the sternothyroid better when the sternohyoid and omohyoid are cut. And lastly, the thyroid muscle here. The infrahyoid muscles stabilize the hyoid bone and keep it from rising so that when the suprahyoid muscles contract, they can move the mandible and not just move the hyoid bone. These muscles act together with both lateral pterygoid muscles to help depress the mandible and act with the posterior fibers of the temporalis muscle to retrude the mandible. These are the other muscles that are related to our oral cavity. All of these are the muscles of the facial expression. Okay. So this is the orbicularis oris, which is responsible in closing or pursing the lips. This is the vaccinator muscle, which pulls the cheek inward to keep food on the chewing surfaces or the occlusal surfaces of the teeth during mastication. We have the upper oral group, which includes the zygomaticus major here, the zygomaticus minor, the levator labii superioris, and the levator anguli oris. Okay. These four muscles are responsible for raising the upper lip and or the angle of the lip, as in smiling. The risorius, which is not shown here in the image but is directed this way as well and is found lateral to the buccinator muscle, is responsible for the retraction of the angle of the mouth. We also have a lower oral group, which includes the depressor labii inferior here, the depressor anguli oris, and the mentalis muscle. The depressor labii inferior and depressor anguli oris is responsible for lowering the lip or the angle of the lip as in a frown. The mentalis is the one responsible in raising or protruding the chin as in a pout. The tongue is a muscular structure found on the floor of the mouth. There are two groups of muscles that are responsible for the movement and for changing the shape of the tongue. The first group of these muscles is the extrinsic muscles. Extrinsic muscles are responsible for moving the tongue. We have four. So all of them uses a suffix glossus. This suffix is used to refer to the tongue. Okay. So we have the genioglossus here, the hyoglossus, the styloglossus, and the palatoglossus. Okay. So again, the extrinsic muscles is responsible for moving the tongue. So it either depresses, protrudes, retracts, or elevates the tongue. The second group of muscles is the intrinsic muscles. Intrinsic muscles are the one responsible in changing the shape of the tongue. Okay? So we also have four types. The longitudinal muscles. We have a superior longitudinal and inferior longitudinal muscle. So this picture is a coronal section of the tongue. Okay? So the longitudinal fibers are oriented anteroposteriorly. So the fibers of the longitudinal muscles runs from the anterior to the posterior tongue, surface of the tongue. So again, we have a superior and an inferior. So these muscles are responsible for shortening and thickening the tongue. It's also the one responsible in curling the tip of the tongue superiorly and inferiorly. The transverse muscles, which runs mediolaterally, so it runs this way, is the one responsible in narrowing and increases the height of the tongue. Okay, so the vertical muscle, which is oriented superior inferiorly, flattens and broadens the tongue. So these are the references which you can read further to understand the temporomandibular joint and the muscles of the oral cavity.